In our readings in 1 Corinthians so far, we've seen that there were a lot of problems in this church. There were divisions based on which man of God people were choosing to follow. There was a lot of immorality because people were abusing their freedom in Christ. They thought that the grace of God gave them the license to live however they wanted to live. And there was a lot of pride and competition in the area of spiritual gifts. People were seeking what they considered to be the more impressive and the most exciting gifts. Yet Paul said clearly that it's the Spirit of God who gives each person their gift. It's not according to the person's faith or according to their spiritual maturity or according to their desire, but the Spirit of God distributes the gifts as He wills. In today's reading, Paul addresses the issue further, but I want to begin with chapter 14, and then I'll go back to chapter 13 and finish from there. Well, as is true in our church today, the church in Corinth had a big overemphasis and a misunderstanding concerning the gift of speaking in tongues. And Paul tells us in chapter 14 a few really important things that we need to understand about that. First of all, that speaking in tongues is only useful if it encourages and builds up the faith of the people in the church. The reason, remember, Paul told us in chapter 12, and he reminds us in chapter 14, the reason that we have spiritual gifts at all is to build up one another in the church, in our faith. And Paul says here that if someone speaks in tongues, but nobody understands what they're saying, then it's useless. This isn't just a personal experience. Because of that, he says in verse 19, I would rather speak 5 words of instruction to teach others than 10,000 words in a tongue that nobody understands. Secondly, Paul says the idea of the whole church babbling together at the same time should never happen. Verse 27, he says only 2 or at the most 3 people should be doing it, and they must interpret. He says God is not a God of confusion, so tongues shouldn't just be a bunch of noise and excitement that doesn't actually help anyone draw closer to Christ. Let all things, Paul says, let all things be done for the building up of the body. The issue isn't what spiritual gift you have or don't have. The issue, Paul says in chapter 13, is your heart. The issue, Paul says, is the love of Christ. He says in verse 1 of chapter 13 that you can speak with the tongues of angels, but if you're not filled with the love of Jesus, if you're not walking in the love of Jesus together as the body, then your tongues are just a bunch of useless noise. He goes on and says in verse 2 that you can be so super spiritual. Maybe you prophesy and have insight into all kinds of mysteries and knowledge. Maybe you have faith that can move mountains. But he says, even if that's true, if you're not consumed with the love of Jesus, if your life is not reflecting the love of Jesus clearly, then he says, you are nothing. Verse 3, he says, you can even be a Christian hero. You can give all of your possessions to the poor. You can give your body to be burned as a martyr. But he says, if the core motivation of your life is not the love of Jesus, then Paul says all of your heroic acts don't profit you anything at all. Not at all. This is so important. Jesus said so clearly in John chapter 13 that the real evidence that we belong to Him is not that we do all of these super spiritual sounding things. He said the real evidence that we're His disciples is that we love one another in the way that He loves us. And Paul tells us what that love looks like. He says the love of Jesus is patient, it's kind, it's not jealous of what we don't have, and it's not arrogant or boastful of what we do have. It's a love that's not focused on our own desires. It's a love that's not easily angered. It's a love, he says, that doesn't keep a record of wrongs which have been done against us. It's a love that always bears with the faults of others. A love that always believes the best that it's possible to believe about someone. A love that always has a hope for what God can do in someone's life. And a love that endures. A love that stands firm and says, no matter what, I'm with you to the end. The love of Jesus, Paul says, is a love that never fails. And at the end of the chapter, he says that in eternity, when there's no longer any need for things like speaking in tongues or prophesying or doing miracles, there will be one thing that will endure forever. And it's the thing that will be the atmosphere and the joy of heaven. And that one thing is the love of Christ. And if it's the only thing that's going to matter then, that means it's the only thing that really matters now.